All right. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Sarah, and I'm very excited to kick off today's conversation. This is the first of two Open Access Week webinars that AIP Publishing Open Science is hosting to celebrate Open Access Week 2025. Today, we'll be focusing on the impact of technology and politics on the question of knowledge ownership. Thursday, shameless plug, we will be doing a conversation around knowledge sovereignty in the context of Latin America, India, and Africa. So if you are able to join us there, please consider joining that conversation as well. So wherever you are, morning, afternoon, or evening, and if you're joining us via recording later, welcome. My name is Sarah Ruki. I'm the Director of Open Science and Publishing Innovation at AIP Publishing. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the American Institute of Physics, and we exist as a not-for-profit publishing arm that enables a global network of both scientific societies and researchers and institutions, all of which are subject to the immense pressures that we're going to be talking about today. Really, whatever node of scholarly publishing you sit in, many of us share this mission to advance science for all. And this conversation today is really going to talk about how easy or difficult that's going to be in the context of a lot that's changing right now. So just to dive into the topics before interviewing and discussing with the fellow panelists. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. We're recording this session. We are going to share an AI-generated synthesis of the conversation after the session, and we'll share the slides as well. So if you're unable to catch everything, you'll get it following the session. So in terms of today's conversation and grounding it a little bit, I like to actually invoke paradigm shift in this conversation because often that term is thrown around just to describe big changes. But if you actually look at the structure of scientific revolutions, which is where Thomas Kuhn coined or popularized the term paradigm shift, he was really speaking to these moments of sudden, unprecedented, and staggeringly disorienting change. And if anything fits the moment we're experiencing across the scholarly communications ecosystem, I feel like that definition of paradigm shift is really appropriate. The context that we'll be coming from are geopolitical shifts, certainly in the US, the UK, Europe, and across Asia, the shift in global priorities or lack thereof in the US context, and then the ubiquity of AI everywhere. I was just telling a friend the other day, if I get another app asking me to turn on the AI function of their tool, I'm gonna scream. So these are suddenly everywhere all at once, and we're gonna speak to that challenge as well. But we're not just talking about these shifts in the context of our silos. The reality is scholarly communications is a complex system, and each of these nodes is already under tremendous pressure before we kind of entered the world in the last 10 months. This is a very reductive overview of that complex system. There's obviously players here that are not represented in this particular visual, but the way I think of this conversation is that when any of these nodes is under pressure, all of us are kind of implicated in the consequences. And that's why I'm really grateful to today's speakers for helping us attempt to have a cross-industry conversation. So with that, I'm going to let each of our speakers introduce themselves and then kick off the conversation by having them speak to the areas of focus and interest that they want to bring to this conversation today, tied to that question of who owns our knowledge, given the challenges we're facing. We're then going to drive straight into a discussion, so there won't be any slides. And as soon as you all on the other side of the screen start throwing in your questions, your comments, I will start feeding those into the conversation. So the Q&A box would be the best place for any actual questions, and the chat would be another place to chat, but I'll lose your questions in there probably. So if I miss something, pop it in the Q&A. And with that, let's just go around the horn. Let's start perhaps with Terry from the publishing perspective. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. I wish that I had an easy answer to the questions that Sarah's asking, but I'm really grateful to be part of the conversation. My name is Terry Tulane, and I'm based in the Boston area, and I oversee the America's business for Emerald Publishing. Emerald's an independent publisher founded in the UK and in the Leeds area in 1967. And our focus has been on a kind of research you can use, applied research. And I've been at Emerald for 2.5 years. I joined from John Wiley and Sons, where I was, and at Blackwell Publishing before that for about 25 years. So the shift from that kind of environment to this one has been really big, and I'm still kind of getting my head around it. But we have a different approach to publishing, and we haven't chased citations over the years. We haven't really we've been involved in a conversation for a long time about real impact and how do you make real impact with research? How do you help researchers plan to have real world impact? So I'm coming at from the publisher perspective. I published for a long time, like I said, at one of the big three publishers. I worked with Learned Society. So I think I'm coming at it from the publishing angle, both from the big commercial side and the smaller organization. And my current kind of interest is really in librarians and the role that librarians play. I know we don't have a librarian. Well, no, we do have a librarian in the group. Sorry. So I'm interested in supporting Josh and the work that Josh does, and what role librarians have, and how all the different players in the ecosystem can work together to make things work better. So,
And Terry, I want to just shout out the work that Emerald has been. Emerald has been one of the few publishers I feel like that has really put in the stake in the ground around academic freedom, research integrity, and pushing all of us to think about the consequences kind of across the industry. So very excited for you to unpack a little bit more of that work over the course of the
thank
conversation
you.
as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that when we get
When
into
we
the
get to
question.
it, fantastic.
Okay.
And Josh, you have so many hats. It's easy to forget that you're the acting acting university librarian. Please take it away.
Thank you. Yes, so hello everybody. I am Josh Sendall, and I am the acting university librarian and keeper of the Brotherton collection here at the University of Leeds, which is in the United Kingdom. Terry, lovely to hear you reference Leeds. I'm sat here enjoying a lovely cup of Yorkshire tea, finest English breakfast tea in the world. So, what do I actually do? I work day to day at the intersection of knowledge equity and open scholarship, but also digital transformation. I do wear different hats. I serve on advisory boards for publishers, intermediaries, technology vendors. I'm also a trustee for UKSG, and UKSG is relevant for this conversation because its mission is to connect the knowledge community and those different constituents, from publishers to the technology vendors to the academic community, and indeed to students, early career professionals, and last but not least, librarians. Um, I feel fundamentally that my work is grounded in the belief that libraries are civic infrastructure for
Mhm.
truth. They are spaces where knowledge is not only preserved, but where knowledge is made meaningfully accessible and ideally co-created with communities. And I'm particularly focused on how libraries can resist extractive models of knowledge production and
Mm.
instead foster inclusive and participatory ecosystems. And those are some of the issues that have been at the focus of an initiative here at the University of Leeds that's seen us begin to develop a a group that is looking at knowledge futures from the perspective of academic libraries. And we had an event a few months ago where we touched on knowledge and its impact on humanity and society, on breaking knowledge hierarchies and democratizing knowledge, and indeed the impact of technologies such as AI, and we'll get there, but also decentralizing and decolonizing knowledge production, digital inclusion, accessibility, and closing the knowledge gap divide. And then last but not least, pertinently relevant, and I'm sure we'll explore it more, misinformation, disinformation, and knowledge assurance. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation today.
So just a few small things, Josh, nothing too comprehensive. Fantastic. Thank you for that. Really excited to get into that. And last but not least, George. George and I have really had the pleasure of engaging with his research work, although he does wear many other hats. So I won't steal your thunder, George. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks, very much for involving me in this webinar discussion. I mean, as Terry said, some challenging questions for us to ponder today, but I'm in excellent company to be doing that, and humbled to be with you all to discuss some of these topics. Also representing Yorkshire alongside Josh here, based in York, the other great city of Yorkshire, of course. So yeah, I do wear many hats, and today I'm wearing primarily my researcher hat. But yeah, I do have a background in scholarly publishing, which also kind of informs my perspective on some of these subjects too. So I've had a professional background developing academic journals in the humanities and social sciences, as well as open access and open research platforms using a kind of post-publication peer review model. But really, my main perspective on this topic, I suppose, which I'll be talking about today, stems from a recently completed PhD at University College London, mainly looking at the censorship of scholarly journals in China, but kind of concerned with this broader idea of the global scholarly record and what that scholarly record consists of. And its kind of status, I think, as a contested resource, a digital resource, and one that's subject to increased fragmentation, I think, now in the political environment that we're operating in. We've seen examples of publishers, what I would term geofencing their output and removing content from the scholarly record in different locations where they face extreme political pressure to do that. And obviously we're seeing similar conditions emerging in the United States, which I'm sure we'll return to, but it's kind of raising these kind of broader questions to me as opposed to the researcher invested in this idea about to what extent is scholarly and scientific knowledge a public good, particularly when governments aim to censor that knowledge on their own notions of the public interest, and so how we might have kind of contested ideas of who the public is that we serve as a kind of scholarly communication industry, interacting also with politics that has its own separate idea of what that public is and what they might want from knowledge. But like Josh, I'm also interested in how we might better distribute the scholarly record so it's more robust and so that it can weather some of these challenges better, not just due to things like censorship, but also kind of more prosaic issues of just digital resilience in the face of things like platform outages, which we've seen a lot of in recent days, the past few weeks. Yep. But also with some quite notable publisher platforms going down. And when you have that very centralized access point to what we might consider that higher standard of knowledge, there's obviously a vulnerability there, which I think we need to think about across the different communities that we work with. So yeah, a few things that I'm sure we'll return to in the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to unpack more of that, George. Thank you for that setup. So, when I first saw the theme for Open Access Week, and I have to say, I don't actually know who comes up with the theme. I think it's a body of folks who come up with the theme. So if someone wants to educate me on that, I welcome it. I was really struck by the question of who owns our knowledge. And, my instinctive answer to that is, well, surely the researcher does, right? The individual who generates the knowledge is the owner of it. But as the four of us have been talking more, that question of co-creation kind of kept coming up for me. And so I wanted to give each of you an opportunity. How do you understand, given the lenses that you just shared, how do you understand that question of who owns knowledge within your contexts? I'll go back reverse now. So George, maybe you can take that.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, again, it's a challenging question, and I hope I'm not sort of hedging myself a bit by giving an answer that maybe doesn't speak about one particular community. But I kind of think about this in terms of the different stakeholders that are involved, both in knowledge production, but also have a kind of a stake in the product of knowledge production too. I talked a little bit about the public, and I think we presume, libraries, publishers, and researchers that we are serving the public in some respect in terms of that knowledge production. But those different parties there that I've just mentioned are all kind of, as I see it, part of an ecosystem of knowledge production and co-creation. And in some respects, I think that system works well. I think there's a kind of a sensible division of labour there and of checks and balances to make sure that knowledge is performing well for those stakeholders and for the wider public. So, you have authors creating knowledge through their research, publishers, editors curating and validating that knowledge, libraries playing a role that Josh mentioned in terms of preserving and connecting knowledge to those end users. And then together we have sort of shared standards and values around publication ethics and metadata, DOIs, etc. And shared values too, increasingly, I think, these different stakeholders around open access, open science and equity. And I think this does come together in this idea of this scholarly record as maybe that site of that kind of final output over which those different stakeholders have a part to play, but also a sense of ownership in the co-creation of that output. And to some extent, it's jointly governed, but not only owned by one actor in that system. I think there are people interacting there that have that joint stake. But as I said before, politics and commercial considerations are still at play there, and some actors might have a slant on this that's different to others, which is where things get more complicated. And obviously, the profit motive doesn't always align well with academic interests. The incentive to grow volume of output, I think, is a good example of that, where publishers and potentially some funders as well, who are also stakeholders here and have a stake in that ownership, might be pushing in one direction, librarians and researchers pushing in another, maybe don't at least ambivalent about volume growth and just want better outputs and higher standards of quality potentially. And then also there's political dynamics there too, and obviously politicians representing the public have a stake there. And that can lead to distortions in that record, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And yeah, to extent, as I said, we've got some regulations in place through bodies like the Committee on Publication Ethics to avoid some of the more kind of egregious forms of distortion that might creep in. But I think I've still got some lingering concerns about how that public good is governed. I mean, those bodies aren't really governance bodies, like the Committee on Publication Ethics.
That's right.
Sets standards, it sets guidelines, but maybe we need to include more stakeholders beyond those that are involved in that body to provide some level of governance. And then also there's this question of how you distribute the scholarly record to make it more robust. I mean, open access, which is obviously what we're going to be talking about as a kind of overarching theme of this week, has some advantages there, because in principle that record can be better distributed, can be shared, reshared, republished in the ways that as I said, this kind of more centralized and paywalled access content can't. And so there's a chance there for communities to kind of, I guess, reclaim some sense of ownership or control over that final scholarly output, that I think obviously publishers need to think carefully about, and those stakeholders need to think about as well. But yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely, I would say, pessimistic about this current political moment in terms of that sense of reclaiming knowledge, because I think in some sense it's conducive to collaboration to have a kind of common threat that politics is starting to distort and make us think more carefully about how that record can be better preserved, and kind of growing that sense of communities of resistance and resilience, I suppose, around knowledge outputs. So yeah, a few thoughts there really on that question.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Before I hand it over to Josh, George, do you mind dropping in the chat that communities of resilience or resistance? There's a researcher that Dan shared with us, Daniel Rudman. I'm totally putting you on the spot here, so if you can't think of it, don't worry. But that might be a text that folks on the webinar might enjoy. And if you can't remember it, I'll dig it up, so no worries. Josh, let me hand it over to you, because I feel like the library is a really interesting connector between the take that George just shared and what we're going to go with the publisher role. So take it away.
It's a complex question, and I think George has provided an excellent exposition of some of the intricacies that characterize the landscape. But, I would almost start by addressing this by looking through a philosophical lens. It is a part of me that just wants to say directly that knowledge as a concept, as a commodity, which is often referred to as, is not a commodity. It is itself a complex landscape, and knowledge can only exist in the mind's eye of human beings. And so I want to begin not necessarily by asking the question, who owns knowledge? It's what is the utility of knowledge that is restricted in terms of access? the more individuals who have the opportunity to engage with the research output, for example, the more utility can be gained from that knowledge. So that's the philosophical point I'd make. And then there's the very real driver that relates to open research, or open science as it's often referred to as, and that's the recognition that the UK research output, okay, so focusing in on the United Kingdom for a moment, is by and large funded by the taxpayer. So to use that phrase that George did for a moment, I often think of universities as being fundamentally a social undertaking for the social good. And so there is a breadcrumb trail that you can follow to the average citizen in the United Kingdom, as George used the phrase, being a stakeholder in knowledge production. But the question you're asking is really about ownership. And rather than answer the question who owns the knowledge, I would highlight an initiative in the United Kingdom and elsewhere that's gained momentum around rights retention, that sees researchers retain the economic and moral rights to their research, and use that as a mechanism to drive open access. And so the academic lawyer in me would respond directly to the question you ask, who owns the knowledge? I would say, okay, you know, you're going to have to refer to the T's and C's of individual contracts. So there's a philosophical, fundamentally moral answer to that question, and then there's a more complex landscape. But I think it's increasingly important that the research community engages critically with the issue of ownership, such that it can better enable the public good.
I'm trying to grab that last piece because I think I really want to come back to that. And Thurston has already raised the question that I knew was going to come up at some point around copyright. So we'll back to that perhaps with you, Josh, specifically, but I want to give Terry a question to jump in on that knowledge ownership piece.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting listening to George and Josh, because I think there is a, you know, very abstract and philosophical and kind of moral element to this. And then there's the kind of practical everyday, how has this system developed? How does the system work now? What does it mean that the system is being, you know, disrupted? So, you know, I'm American, obviously coming from that perspective of just being kind of shocked at how quickly things are changing and how, you know, institutions are kind of falling in a way. I mean, I think from the publisher's perspective, I mean, we're all kind of in the same world, in the sense that I think publishers care, you know, do care about, you know, knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? So I think historically the role of the publisher was to kind of date stamp the research and make it available, you know, print it and make it available. And I think, you know, I was thinking about like kind of the first kind of crisis in scholarly communication that I was around for was that shift to online, you know, like from print to online, and what is that going to mean and everything. And I just think, you know, just like with everything else, things have sped up so much in the last 25 years that it's kind of hard to catch your breath. And I think it is about like I think open is not achieving the aims that it was initially intended to achieve. And I think that one of the reasons for that is just about the money. So I was thinking about, you know, we know what the results have been. We know that, you know, that access to publishing and access to the information, you know, the published research has not really improved in the global South. That the kind of power structure has shifted even further to the global North and to the, you know, so, and I think that kind of tracing my career, I think about, okay, well, there was the online, and then library consortia started working together to increase their purchasing power, and then publishers needed to work with them. And there was a really kind of positive thing about that, I think, which was about reach, you know, so all of a sudden, because everything's online and because you're able to strike these big deals with institutions, you know, there's greater access, right? So that's a positive. But then I think the open access movement, which was born out of, something very like, this idea that knowledge should not be locked away. And I think that, there are a lot of publishers like Emerald who believe that, but there's an economic element to it too, right? So that takes work to run the peer review system. And then we could have a whole other webinar on, compensating various people along the way. But there is at the moment, the way the system works, there's this publisher element. So then open, the combination of I think open and these big deals kind of really kind of perverted the open, perverted what was happening, I think, what the initial intent was. So I think there are a bunch of different elements here. I think publishers were trying to access some of the research money that was coming in to institutions outside of the library, but the historic customer for publishers is the librarian, right? So like research, at least in this, so I'll speak, and I've worked with librarians around the world, but I'll speak to the States right now. Institutions have grown much wealthier and the sort of the student experience in many cases has become much more lavish, than it was 25 years ago. But the library budgets have been squeezed that whole time. So research money that's coming into the institution isn't necessarily flowing into the library, and the library is the one that is negotiating with the publisher. And so what ended up happening is, I think, in order to get that money, publishers kind of, in order to make good on these read and publish deals, publishers were really forced into, quantity versus quality. And we all know the result of that.
Yeah,
That's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that kind of run through of how we've gotten to this moment. And both you and Josh have touched on this, the inequities that have actually been, I hope, unintended from the OA movement and open science. And we'll get into that more on Thursday. So again, shameless plug for that webinar. But we've got a couple questions. I want to weave them in a certain order. So Anton and Thurston, I'm not forgetting you. But I kind of want to tie into some of these questions around the publisher role first, if I may. So one of the things you said, Terry, when you kicked off was this idea of the publisher role. And this is something I'm thinking a lot at AIP Publishing. Many researchers will ask, like, you don't need a publisher, right? Just issue a preprint. Heck, put up a blog post, like it's the internet, right? There's still a lot of, I'm surprised how many researchers I'll still hear that from. And as I was pushing myself, and Rebecca Kennison, the former head of the Columbia University Libraries, I remember she posed this question to me. She's like, well, what do you guys even do? I mean, really, what do publishers do? And I sat and I thought, what is it we do? What is it we do? The answer I had, which she found satisfying, which is Rebecca's hard to satisfy. So I thought there was something to it. We enable the giant technology and human infrastructure required for peer review. So if you value that as a service, as a kind of stewardship mechanism in the scholarly communications ecosystem, that's what we provide. And unfortunately, all the perverse incentives around OA and business models have led to a paradigm in which a lot of that is being undermined through predatory journals and this article economy. But this is a very long way of tying it, George, to what you're saying is publishers are in this really strange place where we are expected to be the last line of defense around a lot of these things, whether it because of that peer review infrastructure, because of the value that we claim we bring for facilitating that, we're expected to catch shoddy research, fraud, back when research integrity issues were less frequent. That seemed reasonable. Now we're expected to basically fight criminal syndicates as a function of peer review. So I wonder if you might dive a little bit into your work, particularly around China, and how publishers have been kind of wiggling to meet the requirements of working in these various contexts, and how they understand what their responsibilities are given the context that they're working in, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's an extremely complicated space. I mean, to take your first point, I suppose, about the publisher role in relation to publication ethics, it is extremely complex, and I think they are being placed in a position where they are having to provide that that first line of defense, and I think that's true. I think it's really important that there are kind of checks and balances across the system, really, and I think that's in some way why it's a good thing that you have publishers operating separately from the different stakeholders that I mentioned. So like the academy, so researchers and librarians, and the other kind of operators there. So the research funders as well, to be that kind of independent body, I suppose, that in some sense isn't mixed with exactly the same interests or conflicts of interest when it comes to assessing research integrity cases when they come up. But I suppose what my research highlighted is that there are still some blind spots there. There are some, I suppose, vulnerabilities that the publishers uniquely are placed under, particularly when they're trying to meet the demands of various other stakeholders in the system. And in the case in China, I suppose where things get very complicated is that the research publishers have to deal increasingly with publication importers, so other intermediaries between the librarian and the publisher that will, in many cases, be operating under very strict governmental constraints about what they can distribute on publishers' behalf to librarians.
George, did you say
markets.
Importer?
Yeah, so like research.
Can you unpack that? Yeah, what does that mean exactly? I've never actually heard it put that way.
Yeah, it's effectively like you would have a sales agent, I suppose, in other contexts. Yes, so someone who acts as an intermediary to help forge, I suppose, those larger content deals, which again Terry was referring to earlier. But specifically to the Chinese market, these operate at a very large scale, and with some of those larger players and publishers. And what happened since about 2017 and also onwards, actually, we've seen instances since then in the research and the conversations I was having, was that publishers would often be presented with often quite opaque directives or constraints about the sorts of material they could and couldn't trade there, the ways that should be administered. And you have this issue, I suppose, where you've got this intermediary who may have some language barriers and also some kind of technological barriers in terms of administering the political constraints in that market, expecting publishers to do some of that work for them, whilst at the same time publishers need to gain access to that market, not just for purely commercial reasons, but because they feel an obligation to serve Chinese scholars and the kind of Chinese research community. So you could see these sometimes quite well-intentioned on the publisher's side incentives hitting political and financial realities in the market. And what I've found is that that leads to an enormous amount of fragmentation. So some publishers may be more exposed in that market than others financially. Some publishers might take a different view as to whether the ethically right route is to try and minimize access to some content in order to maximize access to the rest, whereas others think, no, you should take a principled stand. And also you have the other stakeholders taking different views as well, particularly journal editors and authors, some of who, again, are actually advocating on behalf of censorship, those that I interviewed, because they see that kind of broader motivation to try and maintain knowledge maximization. I think that speaks to what happens when you've got, I suppose, the adjudicating body in this case, the first line of defense, also having an interest and a stake in ways that other stakeholders may find challenging or might not agree with entirely. And so I think for my research, what I've really took away from that was that, these ethics bodies, that there are vulnerabilities there, and you need to have this quite broad set of stakeholders involved in setting not only guidance, but also, as I say, forms of governance, some ways, I suppose, of maybe mandating that publishers operate in certain ways, or maybe, why do research funders only mandate terms around, for example, open access rather than particular approaches to ethics issues, like trying to bring into these various stakeholders together to try and actually better codify, I suppose, what are the ways that they would expect their trusted publishers to operate in a market like that, or to deal with a dilemma like that.
So you've actually flagged something that I think is a real, I think has made folks in our space, in a Western context, very, very uncomfortable because it's utterly new. And I remember doing a webinar with a librarian from Singapore who, was just as things were kicking off, maybe in the first 100 days when we were getting that flurry of executive orders, particularly around science, where, researchers, libraries were really running around with their hair on fire with good reason. This librarian pointed out, he's like, many of us have been living in this context for a really long time, right? And there's a kind of privilege that we've had that we've never had to experience these kinds of trade-offs. And the trade-off that you just articulated there, where perhaps a research community or a library is fine with a certain kind of censorship because it enables access to so much more research, that trade-off, it's not a trade-off many of us have had to make before, feels worthwhile. I think is a really, really new thing. And there was a very thoughtful, somewhat circuitous question here. So to the anonymous attendee, if I don't capture this correctly, please jump in with a clarification. Josh, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to that question of trade-offs, right? So the case, and these are all hypotheticals, but nothing's really hypothetical in the US context right now because everything is on the table. If we were in a world in which, and I'm sure we're going to get there probably, in the next 6 to 12 months, where whole bodies of science are going to be defunded or potentially hidden or deconstructed in some ways, but other areas are going to be massively flooded with funding. How does if that is a world we have to accept, how do we think about those trade-offs? And particularly, how do libraries think about those trade-offs? Where is the principle stand the right approach? Where is the pragmatic stand make more sense? Do with that kind of that knot of questions, which you will.
It is a bit of a Gorgon's knot of a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to unpack, I think some of what's driving the question, what you've outlined there is the increasing politicization of knowledge and attacks on academic freedom and indeed on equity, diversity and inclusion. Important to give names to some of the themes that are beneath the surface there. And it's important to say, first and foremost, libraries and publishers have to engage in a form of partnership to resist the erosion of academic freedom. And what does that fundamentally mean? So you kind of talk about trade-offs, and I might bring us back to what I view as the purpose of an academic library. Indeed, what is required of me as a leader within higher education. And it's fundamentally to serve researchers, to serve students engaged in their educational activity, and also to serve the general public. So those are three very important functions on which I don't think you can compromise. And for me, part of that role then is to defend academic freedom, that right to question and test received wisdom, and to ensure that marginalized voices are not only protected and amplified. And what we've seen in recent years is the mobilization of a form of insidious identity politics, that thing that we refer to as the culture wars. And what I will always attempt to bring us back to is the concept of democracy, the concept of all human beings being endowed with certain inalienable rights. And what I find frustrating of late in the dialogue around censorship and academic freedom and identity politics is that we lose sight of the academic mission and often conflate it with conversations around freedom of speech or freedom of expression. Those are important topics that should be discussed in terms of how they relate to a private citizen's ability to express themselves. But for this conversation, in this context, the thing I'm principally concerned with is a professional academic's ability to pursue their discipline, their domain, their field, to follow that research question wherever it may lead them, so long as their conduct is lawful. So it's a meandering answer to your question, but I want to bring us back to that central purpose of a university, which is partly to question received wisdom. It's to pursue scientific and rational inquiry dogmatically, but we can't risk its erosion through the conflation of conversations that are appositely relating to freedom of expression.
So I think we've had a previous conversation around this, Josh. So I want to tease it out a little bit more to make sure I understand clearly. So when you say that freedom of expression, it sounds like you're making a distinction between freedom of expression and academic, the freedom to, ask a question and pursue its answer in whatever way is appropriate to answer that question. You're making a distinction between that and, say, joining a campus protest. Is that the kind of distinction you're trying to make, or am I misunderstanding?
You're spot on. You're spot
Okay.
on. And again, conscious we've attendees joining us from different legal jurisdictions in the world, but in the United Kingdom, at least, academic freedom is codified in legislation through Section 202, paragraph 2 of the Education Reform Act of 1988. And it's specifically about an academic's freedom to pursue their professional practice as an academic. And it's a qualified right. Whereas freedom of expression is something that's codified through the 1998 Human Rights Act that takes the European Convention on Human Rights and naturalizes it into our law. And Article 10 there protects an individual's freedom of expression. Again, it must be lawful. It's a qualified right. But my fear is that there are certain parts of the world right now that is grappling with societal issues and attempting to weaponize academic freedom when the conversation is properly about freedom of expression.
And this nuance, I mean, you're the first person I think who's flagged this nuance before. I'm thinking about, and forgive me, I'm thinking about the US academic context because so many research institutions are being targeted on multiple fronts, right? So you have faculty who are being fired for things they tweeted about, completely unrelated to their research. You have faculty who are sort of being quiet fired in the sense that all their funding is being taken away, so they can't do the work that they have to do. But we have not been rigorous, I think, in making that distinction. I mean, Terry, I'm thinking of some of the work that we've done in various contexts. We've been lumping those two things together, and there's something important about teasing out that distinction in a way that, again, I haven't heard it framed this way until you brought it up, Josh. So I'm still processing it, but I think there's an important piece there, and particularly in the US context, it's something we need to be more mindful of. Terry, do you have anything you want to sort of say there around that distinction? Because I think publishers are facing a similar challenge, right? When you're told to take down words like inclusion from your website, right? Versus when you are told by a researcher, I can't review for you because there are Chinese authors on this paper, which is actually something that I've heard from an actual publisher, to, well, our publications in this certain subject area are going to go down because there's no more funding for it. So those vectors are happening in publishing too. I'm curious how you guys are thinking about any of that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I kind of reeled through the recent history of the publishing, like the finances of the publishing ecosystem, is because I think we've witnessed a growing kind of different stakeholders moving into their own corners. So there are researchers, there are librarians, there are publishers, there are universities, and I think the dynamic in the scholarly publishing ecosystem has become one that's oppositional and not collaborative. And one of the things that I think, as awful as this moment is from the perspective of censorship and replacing real science with fake science, which is also happening here. I think that it is an opportunity for us to work together. And so the initiatives that Sarah talked about earlier are, the Defend Research Declaration, which Sarah was involved in drafting. Emerald was the first publisher to sign it. And we remain one of the only publishers to sign the declaration, and that's troubling to me. And a couple of other bits of work we've been doing here. One is with the Every Library Institute, which is a US-based nonprofit that it focuses on initially it was fighting censorship in public libraries when all of this kind of stuff was happening. And now they've really pivoted, and part of that is because Emerald was able to underwrite some of this work, and we remain the only academic publisher that's supporting them and working with them. And they're doing a lot of work kind of trying to help librarians in the US in particular figure out how to position themselves in this whole situation. So I think that what I would love to see, and I know, Sarah, you wanted us kind of end on a positive, and I know we're not at the end yet, but just to say, I think
positivity at any time.
Okay.
So
I don't have a lot of positive feelings right now about anything, but I would say that there is opportunity here for the various stakeholder groups to come back together, I think, and think about, why are we here? Why do we do what we do? Why did any of us get involved in the kind of this in this work? And I think there is opportunity to kind of come back together and get back to basics and, maybe rebuild in some way, possibly. So, I mean, my thing right now is just calling on other publishers to kind of stand up and say, we exist because of academic freedom and freedom of thought and the ability of humans to kind of generate thought and riff off each other. And if we don't stand up for that, why are we here?
Thank you for teeing that up. I think I want that to be maybe the closing question that we focus on. This is not enough time to talk about this topic, but I want to pivot slightly, knowing that we could talk about this for 3 more hours, to sort of the technology piece. And I don't think you can separate the technology piece from the political piece, particularly in the US, given the kind of co-optation of the corporate dominance of AI, and the embrace by the current administration to have that stay pretty much a closed corporate endeavor at the expense of, I would argue, the public good. So this might feel like a gear change, but I think all of you have been speaking to it in some way. The thing that's been most interesting for me to observe around AI is really this shift that is going to further disintermediate researchers from the actual research. So you think of researchers as, consumers of AI. They're perhaps using everything from, large language models to help with non-native English speakers who, have to write, all the way to using, very industry-specific AI tools to generate insights and accelerate discovery. But you also then have these communities. I mean, I see this just in my everyday to-day life, people using LLMs as search engines, right? And so you're not even, I mean, Gemini, I think, is the best example of this. Like, I have to remind myself, do not just read the Gemini summary, like go and click on the links to see where it's sourcing the summaries in Google search, because it's not a calculator, right? That's not how LLMs work. And so this idea that researchers are now not necessarily even going to click the link, they're not even going to go to the publisher website. I mean, libraries were bemoaning this, right? When they're just going to the Google search bar, they're not even using the databases that we're investing in to do search. What is going to be given the political context, what does the future look like when researchers are going less and less to the actual peer-reviewed object and relying increasingly on this agent to basically summarize it? What impacts do you see? And George, I'd be curious for you to take this, particularly because I don't know to what extent China is censoring access to tools like ChatGPT. Presumably, they're building their own as well. But yeah, maybe you want to take a stab at that question before we close things out here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Chinese context, and I think there's a risk of this in the US as well, there's obviously the concern around, I suppose, sanctioned AI apps being themselves subject to quite extreme censorship. And we saw that with DeepSeek, you know, the sort of the domestically produced AI chatbot that was obviously a subject of quite a lot of media commentary attention, mainly due to its rapid growth, but also because of this question of censorship. And I think that risk still exists in the States and other markets as well. I mean, I don't want to overlook the concerns which you raise. I think they're really important, and particularly from the kind of researcher perspective as well, about your work being used in ways that aren't very trustworthy. Maybe the environmental costs as well around AI, which are really important to think about, and that sort of loss of nuance and limitation in research outputs that can get kind of distorted in the mix of being gobbled up, I guess, by AI chatbots. But I think thinking about this maybe with more of a publisher hat on, I don't think these are reasons necessarily for publishers to balk at the idea of forming some kind of partnerships with AI organizations and doing that in a responsible way. I mean, there was a recent MIT press survey, I'll pop it in the chat in a bit as well, which looks at kind of some of those author concerns, and they're mainly around things like consent, attribution, compensation. And it strikes me that they're not entirely insurmountable concerns that publishers could play a role in trying to tackle. And I think that publishers have a responsibility to do that, to make sure that tools can produce knowledge that is reliable, that is verified, that's attributed properly to the knowledge producer, and it's as nuanced as possible. I don't think that, obviously some publishers are mired in a few legal challenges here, which for good reason, I think, around LLMs and fair use, and that's still to be tested out in the courts, of course. But I think a whole set of concerns could be addressed quite well with things like opt-in consent and licensing, screening potential partners in the way that you would assess corporate social responsibility for any other partner you partner with, and then paying strict attention to what those licenses look like, how long they last, whether there are good kind of service level review mechanisms in place to make sure that researchers aren't being exploited. Like, there's a whole set of ways that you could actually do this in a much more responsible way.
Right.
And I think publishers have to have a responsibility to kind of move with the times and get into that space and try and improve output. And the last thing I'd say about that is I think that's actually just also say something about how publishers could address disinformation, misinformation, and that loss of trust in scientific output generally, because I think a more responsible integration of AI with scholarship could actually help to democratize the value of scholarship in the first place, if people know what is actually leading to the production of these AI forms of knowledge, and how integral a part that scholarship plays in that. Maybe it gets it out into the public domain better, that we actually provide something of value.
I'm really glad you went there, because that's kind of where I wanted to go with Josh on that same question. Is that, do you think that, this change in researcher behavior and the impact AI is going to have on that might actually, how do you think that's going to impact knowledge equity, if at all?
I mean, it most certainly will. I mean, the first thing I would say is the jack is well and truly out of the box, and it's not going back. Okay, yeah, it's the first thing. We've seen technology have a fundamental shift, a paradigm shift in the academy. The internet is the perfect example of that. I don't think that we will see the death of Boolean search strings. I think advanced searching techniques will remain important, but we have to be cognizant of individual researchers and students' preference for natural language search functionality. That's kind of it's a key thing. Follow the trend, but the application of generative AI as a layer on top of a collection is entirely possible, and many publishers are doing work around retrieval augmented generative AI that sees you draw on peer-reviewed literature rather than the whole of the internet, which many large language models have inadvertently swallowed, ignoring the copyright issues there.
Unless it's you being very generous with the inadvertently. I don't know that I would have classified it as such, but go on.
Yeah, but your question's an important one, and it was around equity, diversity, inclusion, and unintended consequences. And the reality is that technology is something that some have and some do not. And so I
That's a
am
great point.
fortunate enough to work at a university in the United Kingdom, and we have access to an institutional license for Copilot for select group of staff. However, somebody from a different part of the world may not have that same access. And currently we're at a point in time, we think about what is it that makes a library a library? I think it's shared space, shared resources, and great staff. But there is fundamentally an equity question here, and it's about who has access to the technology. And it will always be the case that people from underrepresented, marginalized, and minority backgrounds will face
struggle.
disproportionate challenges to access of a thing that costs money.
And I'm, and to make the complex system more complex, even if we could level all of those inequities that you discussed, there's still the people who have to live next to a data center, right? There are still the resources that are consumed by the machines that do this. There is still the tremendous human cost that comes with enabling these technologies. So to your point, that ripple is a huge one. Terry, as we come to our
There's
final.
just before,
Oh,
just
yeah,
very
please.
briefly,
Yeah.
there is just one other part to the answer to the question that I feel is fundamentally important, and that is that AI is a form of autopoiesis. It's a self-referential system. The risk is that it perpetuates a model of the academy that's already in existence, and that creates what you might call compounded epistemic injustice. So one of the problems with large language models is, of course, it swallows literature as it currently is, and the scholarly record is not necessarily representative of a global knowledge community. And we haven't even touched on indigenous knowledge systems. So we could talk about this all day, but I think those are two areas.
Thank you for flagging that. So in the final minutes here, I was hoping we can end on a positive note, but if we can't, if we can at least go around the horn on perhaps some calls to action, and try to keep them brief so that we can end on time. So Terry, let me let you go first. And for the folks who have answered questions, we're going to try to answer them live, typing in, but if we cannot get to them, we will certainly follow up afterwards. So my apologies for having to try to facilitate the combo and cover your questions. Terry, please.
Yeah, just so very quickly, I would just say, I would just want to call on other publishers to join the conversation about, the freedom to read and the freedom to write and without censorship, and to think without being censored. And I would encourage people to look at the Declaration to Defend Research and at the Every Library Institute, at Scholars at Risk is another organization that's worth looking at. And I just think that I think that we need to stand up for what we believe in. And so that'd be my parting thought.
Thank you. And we'll send links to some of those items that Terry mentioned as part of the follow-up. So we'll make sure we get that to you. George.
So, and yeah, just to end with a couple of kind of quite concrete measures that I guess came out of my research I'd like to leave you with in terms of practical things the industry could do to address some of the concerns we've been talking about. I think it would be great to see a bit more transparency and maybe some more pressure through bodies like COPE and others on publishers to be more transparent about the markets where they face political constraints and where the access to the scholarly record is compromised, and we just haven't really seen that to a very great extent so far. And as I said before, I think we need to pay more attention to public paywall-free places where the scholarly record can be better distributed. There's movements in this space like OpenAlex, and I think that's worth looking at particularly, but it's worth noting that even those indexes require publisher data, so paying great attention to the fact that data isn't subject to political constraint. But really just to echo some of the things I think Terry was talking about too before, I think that publishers need to be part of that conversation about how scholarship can be distorted further upstream and play more of an active role in trying to advocate for the value of research and of scholarship generally through public education, community outreach, better media engagement, and potentially government lobbying to make sure that the higher education and research sectors are better protected from government interference.
That's huge. Josh, I'll let you close us out, please.
Gosh, thank you. I preach, and I hope I practice, the African philosophy of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu essentially recognizes the interconnected nature of different members of a community. It says that I am because we are, and many of the issues that we've discussed today are fundamentally important for academic libraries, but also for publishers. And it is only through leaning into the challenging conversations as one scholarly communications community that we can navigate some of the grand challenges that we've discussed today. And I would end with a quote I often do, the words of the women's rights activist and cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small, thoughtful, committed group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much for this really thoughtful conversation. I think we're going to be having many more in the coming months. So hopefully we can reconstitute this group again with more voices. A huge thank you to our audience and to the folks behind the screen helping enable the webinar today. We will follow up as promised probably next week and hopefully see some of you on Thursday. Thank you all so much again. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
Excellent.